The screech of metal against asphalt still echoes through the cobblestone streets of Hexham, Northumberland, even decades after that cursed morning of May 5th, 1957. Some say if you walk down Hexham Abbey grounds at twilight, when shadows stretch long and thin like grasping fingers, you can still hear the phantom cries of children, cries that were silenced in an instant, only to return years later from the throats of those who should never have known such terror. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand a horror that would later unfold in the Pollock household, we must first witness the tragedy that set this supernatural nightmare in motion. The mourning mist clung to the ancient town like a burial shroud, unusual for a May Day that should have brought warmth and light. Mrs. Florence Day, an elderly woman whose mind had begun to fray at the edges like old parchment, sat behind the wheel of her Ford Anglia with vacant eyes that reflected nothing but an abyss. She had been struggling with what doctors then dismissively called nervous troubles, a condition we might now recognize as severe mental illness, left untreated and festering in the shadows of 1950s medical ignorance. At precisely 10:15 a.m., as the town clock's chimes cut through the unnatural silence, Mrs. Day's foot found the accelerator. The engine roared to life with a sound that witnesses would later describe as otherworldly, not mechanical, but organic, like the death rattle of some massive beast. The car lurched forward, picking up speed with terrifying determination, as if guided by an invisible hand toward its predetermined target. On the pavement ahead, 3 children walked in innocent bliss, unaware that fate had marked them for destruction. 11-year-old Joanna Pollock skipped alongside her younger sister, 6-year-old Jacqueline, their matching blonde hair catching what little sunlight pierced the oppressive gloom. Behind them, 9-year-old Anthony Layden followed, his school satchel bouncing against his small frame with each carefree step. The children were heading to church, to worship, to seek blessing, to find sanctuary in the house of God. The cruel irony would not be lost on the town's inhabitants in the days that followed, as they whispered that perhaps no divine protection existed at all, or worse, that something malevolent had deliberately orchestrated this collision between innocence and madness. What happened next unfolded with the horrible precision of a nightmare. Mrs. Day's vehicle mounted the pavement with impossible force, the sound of crushing stone mixing with the screech of tires to create a symphony of destruction. The car struck all 3 children simultaneously, their small bodies disappearing beneath 2 tons of steel and hatred. For yes, hatred seemed to emanate from the very metal of that cursed vehicle, as if it had become a vessel for something far more sinister than mere mechanical failure. The impact was instant and absolute. Joanna and Jacqueline Pollock died immediately, their lives extinguished like candles in a hurricane. Young Anthony Layden clung to life for one more day, his broken body fighting against the inevitable in the local hospital, before succumbing to his injuries on May 6. 3 young souls, ripped from the world in a moment of inexplicable violence. But death, as the Pollock family would soon discover, was not the end of the story. It was merely the beginning of something far more terrifying. John Pollock, the girl's father, stood over their small coffins 3 days later, his face a mask of grief, so profound it seemed to physically alter his features. His wife, Florence, had retreated so deep into shock that she barely responded to her own name. The funeral service at Hexham Abbey was attended by nearly the entire town, all of them struggling to comprehend how such senseless tragedy could befall a community known for its quiet, uneventful existence. Father McNeil, the local priest, delivered a service that felt more like an exorcism than a burial rite. His hands trembled as he read from the scriptures, and several witnesses would later claim they saw his lips moving in what appeared to be Latin phrases not found in any conventional prayer book. The air inside the abbey seemed to thicken during the ceremony, becoming so oppressive that 3 mourners fainted, and a 4th, Mrs. Henderson from the local bakery, claimed to see the shadows of the deceased children standing beside their own coffins, watching the proceedings with eyes that held knowledge no child should possess. As the tiny coffins were lowered into the consecrated ground of Hexham Cemetery, something inexplicable occurred. The earth itself seemed to resist their burial. The rope supporting Joanna's coffin snapped not once, but 3 times, forcing the gravediggers to use backup equipment. When Jacqueline's coffin was finally laid to rest, a sound emerged from the ground, a low, resonant humming that made the mourners' teeth ache and caused several dogs in the vicinity to howl in distress. John Pollock, a man who had never been particularly religious despite his weekly church attendance, found himself consumed by an obsession that would have seemed impossible just days before. He began to speak, first to his devastated wife, then to anyone who would listen, about reincarnation, about the possibility that death was not the final chapter, about signs and portents that suggested his daughters would return to him. His neighbors attributed this to grief-induced madness. His wife worried for his sanity. But John Pollock had experienced something in those moments after the accident, something he could never quite articulate but could never forget. As he had held his daughter's broken bodies, he had felt them leave, not just stop breathing, but actually depart, as if their essence had lifted from their physical forms and hovered above the scene of destruction. And in that moment of supernatural perception, he had sensed something else, a promise, or perhaps a threat, that this separation was temporary. The weeks following the funeral brought no peace to the Pollock household. Florence barely ate, barely spoke, barely acknowledged the world around her. John threw himself into research, reading everything he could find about life after death, about souls, seeking new vessels, about the possibility of return. His collection of books grew to include works by Ian Stevenson, Edgar Casey, and other researchers into the paranormal, each volume filled with accounts that seemed to mirror his own growing certainty. Sleep became elusive for both parents, but for different reasons. Florence couldn't sleep because of the grief that felt like physical weight pressing down on her chest. John couldn't sleep because of the dreams, vivid, terrifying dreams in which his daughters spoke to him from beyond the grave, their voices carrying messages he couldn't quite remember upon waking, but which left him with the unshakable conviction that they were trying to tell him something crucial about what was to come. Neighbors began to avoid the Pollock house. There were reports of strange lights in the windows at all hours, of voices, young girl voices, heard coming from rooms that should have been empty. Mrs. Thompson from next door claimed she had seen the silhouettes of two children playing in the garden, visible only in the reflection of her own windows, never when she looked directly at the yard. The local postman, Mr. Hartwell, a man known for his pragmatic nature and complete lack of imagination, began leaving the Pollocks' mail at the gate rather than approaching the front door. When pressed by curious neighbors, he would only say that something about the house made his skin crawl, that he could feel eyes watching him from windows that he knew were empty, and that twice he had heard children laughing from within the walls, laughter that held no joy, only a hollow echo that reminded him of sounds he had heard in France during the war, the sounds made by things that should have been dead but weren't quite ready to rest. As autumn approached, bringing with it shorter days and longer shadows, Florence Pollock began to show signs of emerging from her catatonic grief. But instead of returning to her previous self, she seemed to be transforming into something else entirely. She began talking to empty spaces in the house, having conversations with invisible presences, nodding and responding to unheard questions. When John asked her who she was speaking with, she would look at him with eyes that held a distance deeper than sorrow, a distance that suggested she was seeing things he could not, hearing voices he was not meant to hear. "They're coming back," she whispered to him one evening as they sat before the fireplace, the flames casting dancing shadows that seemed to take the shape of small figures. "They're coming back, and when they do, we need to be ready." "But John," her voice trailed off as she stared into the fire, and when she spoke again, her words carried a chill that had nothing to do with the October wind rattling the windows. "When they come back, they might not be the same children we lost. Something else might come with them, something that's been waiting for a doorway back into our world." That night, as if summoned by Florence's words, the dreams changed. John no longer saw his daughters as he remembered them, bright, innocent, full of life. Instead, he saw them as they were in those final moments, broken and bleeding on the pavement, but with eyes that held ancient knowledge, with voices that spoke in languages he didn't recognize but somehow understood. They told him about the place between life and death, about the things that dwelt in that liminal space, about bargains that could be made and prices that would eventually come due. And they told him about the birth that was coming, about the vessels that would carry them back into the world of the living. But as they spoke, their forms began to shift and change, becoming less human and more something else. Something that wore the faces of his daughters, but harbored intentions that belonged to entities far older and far more malevolent than two little girls who had simply wanted to attend church on a sunny morning. When John woke from these dreams, he would find Florence standing at the window, staring out at the cemetery in the distance, her lips moving in silent conversation with the darkness beyond the glass. And in that darkness, if he looked carefully, he could sometimes see small shapes moving between the headstones, shapes that gestured toward their house with movements that suggested not beckoning, but claiming. The final sign came on Halloween night, exactly 5 months and 26 days after the accident. As the rest of Hexham celebrated with costumes and candy, the Pollock house experienced its own visitation. Every door in the building opened simultaneously at the stroke of midnight, and a cold wind swept through the rooms carrying the scent of earth and flowers. Funeral flowers. In Joanne and Jacqueline's room, which had remained untouched since their deaths, their toys began to move on their own, dolls turning their heads to follow the movement of invisible playmates, toy tea sets rattling as if unseen hands were conducting a ghostly party. But most disturbing of all was what happened to the family photographs. Every picture containing images of the deceased children began to change, the girls' faces shifting subtly, their expressions becoming knowing and strange, their eyes following John and Florence as they moved through the house. In the largest family portrait, hanging above the fireplace, the girls' mouths appeared to be moving, as if they were trying to communicate something crucial, something that would determine the nature of their return. And return they would. For on that same Halloween night, as the supernatural activity in the Pollock house reached its crescendo, Florence collapsed in the hallway, her body racked with convulsions that no medical explanation could account for. When she finally opened her eyes hours later, she looked at her husband with an expression of profound joy mixed with absolute terror. "It's time," she whispered, and John knew with horrible certainty that their daughters were indeed coming back. But as the supernatural phenomenon in the house reached a fever pitch, as shadows took on substance and the air itself seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, he began to wonder what else might be coming with them, and whether the price of their return would be more than any parent should be asked to pay. The stage was set for one of the most documented and terrifying cases of alleged reincarnation in human history. But as John and Florence Pollock would soon discover, some doors should never be opened, some calls should never be answered, and some loves are so strong they can breach the barrier between life and death, bringing with them consequences that no living soul is prepared to face. The dead were returning to Hexham, but they would not be coming back alone. October 4th, 1958, a date that would forever mark the Pollock family as either blessed or cursed, depending on who told the tale. 18 months had passed since a horrific May morning, when death had come calling in the form of Mrs. Florence Day's speeding Ford Anglia. Now, as autumn painted the Northumberland countryside in shades of amber and crimson, Florence Pollock lay in the maternity ward of Hexham General Hospital, her body racked with labor pains that seemed to carry an otherworldly intensity. The nurses whispered among themselves about the strange circumstances surrounding Mrs. Pollock's pregnancy. She had conceived exactly 9 months to the day after her daughter's funeral, a timing that seemed impossible given her catatonic state following the tragedy. Yet here she was, delivering not one child, but two, despite doctors having detected only a single heartbeat throughout the entire pregnancy term. The medical staff had no explanation for this phenomenon, and their confusion only deepened when they realized that Mrs. Pollock appeared to be giving birth to identical twins from separate amniotic sacs, a biological impossibility that would haunt medical journals for decades to come. Dr. Harrison Whitmore, a seasoned obstetrician who had delivered hundreds of babies over his 30-year career, found his hands trembling as he assisted with the birth. Something about the entire situation felt wrong, unnatural, as if he were witnessing not the beginning of life, but the completion of some dark bargain struck in realms beyond human comprehension. The delivery room itself seemed to pulse with an energy that made his teeth ache, and twice he had to pause the procedure when the overhead lights flickered in patterns that resembled Morse code, though no one present could decipher what message might be trying to come through. The first child emerged at 11:47 p.m., her tiny body seemingly normal in every way except for her eyes. While newborns typically cannot focus their gaze, this infant fixed her dark eyes directly on Dr. Whitmore with an intensity that made him step back involuntarily. Those eyes held knowledge, awareness, recognition, expressions that no child should possess at birth. She did not cry upon entering the world. Instead, she made a sound that the attending nurse, Mrs. Catherine Mills, would later describe as almost like singing, but not quite human. Exactly 13 minutes later, at the stroke of midnight, as if timed by some supernatural clock, the second twin made her appearance. If the first child had been unsettling, the second was genuinely terrifying. She emerged with what appeared to be a birthmark on her forehead, a thin white line that bore an uncanny resemblance to a scar. Dr. Whitmore had seen many birthmarks in his career, but this one seemed to pulse with its own pale light, and when he leaned closer to examine it, he could swear he heard the faintest whisper of wind, as if something were breathing just beneath the child's skin. But it was not just a mark on her forehead that caused the medical staff to exchange alarmed glances. This second child bore another mark, a brown birthmark on her left hip, that matched exactly the position and shape of a scar that Jacqueline Pollock had carried from a fall when she was 3 years old. The resemblance was so precise that Mrs. Mills dropped her instruments, her face draining of color as she stared at the tiny body before her. Florence Pollock, exhausted from the traumatic birth, looked at her newborn daughters with an expression that mixed maternal love with profound fear. As the nurses cleaned and examined the twins, she whispered something that chilled everyone in the room. "Welcome back, my darlings. I hope you remember who you used to be." John Pollock, who had been pacing the hospital corridors for the past 12 hours, burst into the delivery room the moment he was allowed entry. His reaction to seeing the twins was immediate and visceral. He fell to his knees beside Florence's bed, tears streaming down his face, but his expression was not one of joy at new life. It was a look of a man who had witnessed a miracle so terrible it might have been better left unwished for. "Joanna," he whispered, reaching toward the first twin, then turned to the second, Jacqueline. The names came to him not as choices for his new daughters, but as recognition, as if he were greeting old friends returned from a long and terrible journey. The medical staff exchanged worried glances, clearly concerned about the father's mental state, but their skepticism began to waver when they observed the twins' reactions to these names. Both infants turned their heads toward John with perfect synchronization, their tiny faces displaying expressions of recognition that defied medical explanation. The first twin, the one John had called Joanna, made a sound that was unmistakably one of greeting, while the second began to move her tiny arms in what appeared to be an attempt to reach for him. These were not the random movements of newborns. They were purposeful, deliberate actions that suggested consciousness far beyond what should have been possible. Dr. Whitmore completed his examinations with growing unease. Both children were physically healthy, but several aspects of their condition troubled him deeply. Their neural responses were unusually advanced. Their eye movements tracked objects with precision that typically didn't develop for weeks, and most disturbing of all, they seemed to respond to voices and sounds with recognition rather than the startled reflexes common in newborns. When he attempted to separate the twins for individual examinations, both children became agitated in a way that seemed almost supernatural. They would cry in perfect harmony, not the typical wailing of distressed infants, but a sound that rose and fell in minor keys, creating an effect that made everyone in the room profoundly uncomfortable. The crying would stop immediately when they were placed side by side, and they would turn toward each other with movements that suggested not the random motions of newborns, but the deliberate actions of siblings who had been separated and were relieved to be reunited. The hospital staff's discomfort reached its peak during the twins' first feeding. Florence had difficulty breastfeeding, a common issue for new mothers, but when the nurses attempted to supplement with bottles, something extraordinary occurred. Each twin would only accept feeding when positioned exactly as Joanna and Jacqueline Pollock had preferred. The elder child, whom John continued to call Joanna, only from the right breast or bottle held in the right hand, the younger Jacqueline, only from the left. When the nurses attempted to vary this pattern, both children would refuse to eat entirely, turning their heads away with expressions of what could only be described as disdain. More unsettling still were the twins' sleeping patterns. Rather than the erratic sleep cycles typical of newborns, they maintained perfect synchronization. When one slept, both slept. When one woke, both woke. They would often be found in their separate bassinets positioned identically, their tiny bodies turned toward each other as if maintaining some form of silent communication. On several occasions, night shift nurses reported seeing the twins' lips moving simultaneously, as if they were carrying on conversations in a language that existed beyond spoken words. Mrs. Mills, the attending nurse, began to document these oddities in the hospital records, but her supervisor instructed her to keep such observations private. The reputation of Hexham General Hospital, he explained, could not afford to be associated with supernatural speculation. Yet Mrs. Mills continued her private notes, driven by a growing conviction that she was witnessing something that challenged everything she believed about life, death, and the nature of human consciousness. On the second night after the birth, Mrs. Mills was making her routine checks when she discovered something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. As she approached the twins' bassinets, she heard what sounded like children's laughter. Not the gurgling sound that newborns sometimes make, but actual laughter, clear and melodic and impossibly mature. When she peered over the edge of the first bassinet, she saw that while the infant appeared to be sleeping, her lips were curved in a smile that held knowledge and mischief that belonged to an older child. The second twin was even more disturbing. Her eyes were wide open, staring directly at Mrs. Mills with an intensity that made the nurse's blood run cold. As their gazes met, the infant's mouth moved, and Mrs. Mills could swear she heard a whisper. "We know you." The words were impossibly clear, spoken in a voice that seemed older than the tiny body that produced it. Mrs. Mills stumbled backward, her hand reaching for the light switch, but when the overhead illumination flooded the room, both twins appeared to be sleeping peacefully, showing no signs of the supernatural awareness she had witnessed just moments before. She stood there for several minutes, her heart pounding, wondering if exhaustion had caused her to hallucinate. But deep in her bones, she knew what she had seen and heard was real. The following morning brought new concerns. Dr. Whitmore arrived for his rounds to find that both twins had somehow managed to remove their identification bracelets during the night. This should have been impossible. The bracelets were designed to be tamper-proof, and newborns lacked the motor skills necessary for such manipulation. Yet there the tiny plastic bands lay on the floor between the bassinets, cut cleanly through as if by scissors, though no sharp instruments were present in the nursery. More troubling still was the discovery that the twins had been placed in the wrong bassinets. The child with the forehead marked Jacqueline was in the bassinet labeled for Joanna, while Joanna was in Jacqueline's place. The night nurse swore she had not moved them, and security cameras showed no staff entering the room during the crucial hours when the switch must have occurred. It was as if the children had somehow exchanged places on their own, maintaining their connection in ways that defied physical limitations. When John and Florence came to collect their daughters for the journey home, the hospital staff was visibly relieved to see them go. Dr. Whitmore pulled John aside for a private conversation, intending to discuss his concerns about the unusual circumstances surrounding the twins' birth and behavior. But when John looked at him with eyes that held depths of knowledge and pain that seemed to go beyond normal human experience, the doctor found himself unable to speak. "I know what you want to ask," John said quietly, "and I know what you've observed. But Dr. Whitmore, there are some questions that shouldn't be asked and some answers that shouldn't be given. My daughters are home now. That's all that matters." As the Pollock family left the hospital, several staff members reported feeling an inexplicable sense of relief, as if some oppressive presence had lifted from the building. Mrs. Mills, however, experienced the opposite sensation. As she watched the car disappear down the road toward the Pollock home, she felt a chill that seemed to penetrate her very soul. She had the distinct impression that she had just witnessed not a homecoming, but a return, something that had been absent from the world coming back to claim what it believed to be rightfully its own. That evening, as the twins settled into the nursery that had once belonged to their predecessors, neighbors began to report strange phenomena in the vicinity of the Pollock house. Lights flickered in windows throughout the neighborhood. Dogs began howling in harmonies that seemed almost musical. And several residents claimed to hear children's laughter echoing through the streets. Not one voice or two, but what sounded like 4 different children, all laughing together in perfect, otherworldly synchronization. Mrs. Thompson, the next-door neighbor who had previously reported seeing ghostly children in the Pollock garden, made the most disturbing observation of all. As she watched from her bedroom window, she saw John Pollock carrying his newborn daughters into their home. But in the reflection of her own window glass, she claimed to see something else entirely. 4 children entering the house, 2 infants and 2 older girls, all of them walking hand in hand in a procession that seemed to shimmer between the physical world and some other realm entirely. The twins were home, but as the residents of Hexham would soon discover, they had not returned alone. Something else had come back with them, something that had been waiting in the shadows between life and death for a chance to reclaim its place in the world of the living. The impossible birth was complete, but it was only the beginning of phenomena that would challenge everything the community thought they knew about the nature of existence itself. As night fell over the Pollock household, the twins lay in their cribs, but their sleep was filled with dreams of lives they should not remember, of faces they should not recognize, of knowledge that belonged to souls far older than their tiny bodies could contain. And in those dreams, they were not alone. Other presences moved in the shadows, ancient things that had been drawn to the light of return, waiting for their own chance to cross back into the realm of the living. The birth certificates would list them as Gillian and Jennifer Pollock, new lives beginning in a world full of possibilities. But the truth was far more complex and infinitely more terrifying. The dead had indeed returned to Hexham, wearing the faces of innocent children, but carrying within them memories, knowledge, and purposes that belonged to entities that should have remained buried in the cold earth of the cemetery that overlooked their new home. The first sign that something was fundamentally wrong with the Pollock twins came when they began to walk. Most children take their first tentative steps around their first birthday, but Gillian and Jennifer Pollock, though John and Florence continued to call them by their former names, were pulling themselves upright and moving with purpose by their 8th month. What made this development truly unsettling was not merely their precocious mobility, but the places they chose to go. Time and again, Florence would find the twins in rooms they should not have been able to reach, standing together before family photographs that featured their deceased predecessors. They would point at the images with tiny fingers and babble in what sounded like conversations, their infant voices rising and falling in patterns that suggested they were identifying familiar faces. When Florence tried to distract them with toys or food, they would become agitated, returning to the photographs with determination that seemed to border on desperation. But it was their behavior in the garden that truly chilled their parents to the bone. The backyard of the Pollock home contained a small play area where Joanna and Jacqueline had spent countless hours before their deaths. Their swing set still stood there, weathered by 18 months of neglect, and it was to this forgotten playground that the twins were inevitably drawn. They would crawl through the grass with single-minded purpose, pull themselves upright on the rusted metal supports, and then stand perfectly still, staring at the empty swings as if watching invisible playmates enjoying a ghostly recreation. Dr. Evelyn Morrison, a child psychologist from Newcastle whom the Pollocks had consulted about their daughter's unusual behavior, attributed these patterns to environmental familiarity. Children, she explained, often showed strong attraction to objects and spaces that held significant emotional resonance within their household. But her clinical confidence began to waver when she observed the twins during a home visit in March of 1959. At 5 months old, Jillian and Jennifer should have been capable of coordinated play. Yet Dr. Morrison watched in growing unease as they engaged in what could only be described as elaborate games of pretend. Using wooden blocks and dolls in their toy collection, they would construct scenarios that bore disturbing similarities to domestic scenes from the lives of their deceased sisters. They positioned dolls around miniature furniture in precise arrangements, moved toy cars across imaginary roads, and even recreated what appeared to be tea parties, complete with the specific seating arrangements that Joanna and Jacqueline had preferred during their own childhood games. Most unsettling of all was their reaction to the room that had belonged to their predecessors. John and Florence had kept Joanna and Jacqueline's bedroom exactly as it had been on the morning of the accident. Clothes still in drawers, books still on shelves, toys still arranged according to particular preferences each child had developed. The twins were not allowed in this room. It remained locked at all times, a shrine to memory that their parents could neither bear to enter nor bring themselves to dismantle. Yet somehow, the twins knew what lay beyond that locked door. They would crawl to the threshold and press their tiny hands against the wood, their babbling taking on urgent, almost pleading tones. When Florence or John approached, the twins would look up at them with expressions that seemed to ask why they were being kept from their belongings, their territory, their rightful space. On several occasions, both parents reported hearing sounds from within the sealed room, footsteps, voices, the sound of toys being moved. But when they unlocked the door to investigate, everything remained exactly as they had left it. The breakthrough, if such a terrifying development could be called that, came during the twins' first birthday celebration in October 1959. Florence had prepared a small party, inviting only immediate family members, as the twins' strange behavior had made social gatherings increasingly difficult. As the adults sang happy birthday and presented a cake decorated with a single candle, Jillian suddenly looked directly at her Aunt Margaret and spoke her first clear word, "More!" This should have been a moment of celebration, but the way Jillian delivered the word was identical to Joanna's characteristic demand for additional treats during past birthday parties. The inflection, the timing, even the accompanying gesture, a pointing finger directed at the cake with imperious expectation, perfectly mirrored the mannerisms of a child who had been dead for more than 2 years. Jennifer's first word came moments later, and it froze the blood of everyone present. Looking directly at John, she said clearly, "Daddy hurt." These were the exact words Jacqueline had spoken after falling from her bicycle and sustaining the injury that had left a scar on her hip, the scar that Jennifer now bore as a birthmark in precisely the same location. Dr. Morrison, who was present for this incident, later wrote in her private notes that she had observed behavior that challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness, memory, and the nature of individual identity. But she was careful to keep such observations out of her official reports, aware that her professional reputation could not survive association with supernatural speculation. As the twins entered their second year of life, their behavior became increasingly specific and disturbing. They developed preferences for foods that had been favorites of Joanna and Jacqueline, foods they had never been exposed to in their current lifetime. Jillian showed an inexplicable love for strawberry jam on brown bread, eaten in precise manner Joanna had preferred, with the crust removed and cut into triangular quarters. Jennifer developed Jacqueline's habit of eating around the edges of biscuits first, saving the center for last, an idiosyncratic behavior that she performed exactly as her predecessor had done. More troubling still were their nightmares. Both twins would wake simultaneously, screaming in terror about the car and the lady with angry eyes. They would huddle together in their shared crib, pointing toward the window that faced the direction of the town center, babbling frantically about something coming to hurt them. These episodes occurred most frequently around the anniversary of the original accident, as if their infant bodies were somehow remembering trauma they had never experienced. Florence began keeping a detailed diary of these incidents, documenting behaviors and statements that seemed to reference memories from their deceased sisters' lives. The journal filled rapidly with observations that painted a picture of consciousness that transcended physical death. March 15th, 1960, Jillian today pointed to a photograph of Joanna's school class and correctly identified Mrs. Patterson, her former teacher, saying, "Teach lady despite never having attended school or met anyone from Joanna's educational experience." April 3rd, 1960. Jennifer found a hidden compartment in Jacqueline's jewelry box, a secret space that even I had forgotten existed. She removed a small locket that had belonged to Jacqueline and held it to her chest, saying "mine pretty" in exactly the possessive tone Jacqueline had used. May 5th, 1960, third anniversary of the accident. Both twins became agitated at precisely 10:15 a.m., the exact time of the original collision. They refused to leave the house and spent the entire day hiding under furniture, emerging only after sunset. When I asked what was wrong, Jillian said, "Car day," and Jennifer added, "hurt day," with expressions of knowledge no 2-year-old should possess. The most compelling evidence of the twins' impossible memories came during a visit to Hexham's main shopping district when they were 2.5 years old. Florence had taken them to purchase new clothes, their first return to the town center since their birth. As they walked down the high street, both children suddenly became extremely agitated, pointing toward a specific location on the pavement and beginning to cry with intensity that attracted concerned stares from passers-by. The spot they indicated was precisely where the accident had occurred more than 3 years earlier. There were no markers, no obvious indications that tragedy had struck there, yet both twins recognized the location with an accuracy that chilled Florence to her core. Jennifer began repeating, hurt place," while Jillian pointed at the pavement and said with crystal clarity, "This where we got broken." But it was what happened next that convinced even the most skeptical observers that something supernatural was at work. As Florence knelt to comfort her distressed children, Jennifer looked past her toward the bakery across the street and said, "Tony there." Florence followed her gaze and saw Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife, standing in her shop window. But Jennifer wasn't looking at Mrs. Henderson. She was staring at empty space beside the woman, as if seeing someone who wasn't there. When Florence later spoke with Mrs. Henderson, she learned something that made her blood run cold. Anthony Layden, the third victim of the accident, had been Mrs. Henderson's nephew. The child often visited the bakery, and his favorite spot had been the exact location where Jennifer had been staring, a corner beside the display case where he would sit and eat warm biscuits while chatting with his aunt. Mrs. Henderson confided that she still sometimes felt his presence in that corner, still sometimes set out an extra biscuit, as if he might suddenly appear to claim it. The twins' knowledge extended beyond memories of their own deaths to include details about the lives they had lived before the accident. By their third birthday, the twins had developed an unsettling habit of speaking to empty spaces. Florence would find them engaged in animated conversations with corners of rooms, their voices carrying the cadence of children negotiating play dates with invisible friends. But these weren't imaginary companions. The twins spoke as if addressing specific individuals they could see, but others could not. "Anthony says a scary lady is coming back," Jennifer announced one morning at breakfast, her voice matter-of-fact in the way only children could manage when discussing the impossible. Jillian nodded gravely, adding, "He watches from the window place where the bread smells live." Mrs. Henderson's bakery, where Anthony Layden had spent countless hours before his death, had become a focal point for supernatural activity. Customers reported feeling watched while shopping, and the ovens would mysteriously turn on during the night, filling the space with the scent of phantom baking. Mrs. Henderson herself had begun seeing a small figure in her peripheral vision, a boy-shaped shadow that vanished when she turned to look directly. The twins' ability to perceive their deceased friend grew stronger with each passing month. They would wave at empty doorways, set places at their play table for guests no one else could see, and most unervingly, they would suddenly stop their activities and stand perfectly still, their heads tilted as if listening to urgent whispers only they could hear. Dr. Morrison returned for follow-up observations, bringing with her colleagues from Edinburgh University who specialized in paranormal psychology. What they witnessed defied academic explanation. The twins not only demonstrated detailed knowledge of their deceased sisters' lives, but also displayed awareness of events that had occurred after the original deaths. Conversations between John and Florence had taken place while the twins were sleeping, visits from relatives they had never met, even details about the accident investigation that had never been discussed in their presence. During one particularly chilling session, Jillian looked directly at Dr. Morrison and said, "The man with the white coat thinks we're just pretending, but Anthony shows us pictures of the day we got hurt. Do you want to see them too?" The room temperature dropped noticeably, and several recording devices malfunctioned simultaneously. In the sudden silence, all present heard what sounded like children's laughter coming from multiple directions at once. Not just two voices, but four, harmonized in a melody that seemed to originate from somewhere beyond the physical world. That night, every resident of Hexham reported the same dream. 3 children standing at the foot of their beds, watching with eyes that held knowledge of death and secrets of return. The children in the dreams didn't speak, but their presence carried a message that resonated in the minds of all who encountered them. The boundary between life and death was not as solid as the living believed, and sometimes love could be strong enough to tear holes in that boundary, holes through which more than just beloved children might slip back into the world of the living. As the twins approached their 4th birthday, the supernatural phenomena surrounding them intensified to a degree that could no longer be dismissed or rationalized. The family home had become a nexus of paranormal activity that affected not just the Pollocks, but the entire neighborhood of Hexham. Street lamps would flicker in sequence as the twins walked beneath them during evening strolls. Clocks throughout the town would stop at 10:15 a.m. on the 5th of each month, the exact time and date of the original accident. Most disturbing of all, other children in the community began reporting dreams in which Joanna and Jacqueline appear to them, speaking of the place where hurt children wait and asking when they might be allowed to come home properly. Florence's diary entries from this period revealed a woman teetering on the edge of madness. October 1962. They spoke in unison today, completing each other's sentences about events from before they were born. But it's not just memory anymore. They seem to be channeling something else, something that uses their voices to communicate things children shouldn't know. Jennifer told me today that the Dark Ones are getting restless and that Anthony is trying to keep them back, but he's just one little boy against so many old things. The twins had developed an obsession with the Hexham Cemetery, particularly the section where their former selves were buried. They would stand at the garden fence, pointing toward the distant headstones, and engage in lengthy conversations about who was sleeping too deep and who was trying to wake up. Their knowledge of the cemetery's inhabitants was encyclopedic and impossible. They knew names, dates of death, and personal histories of people who had been buried decades before their birth. Dr. Ian Stevenson, the renowned researcher of reincarnation cases, arrived from Virginia to study the twins personally. His initial skepticism dissolved within hours of beginning his investigation. Not only did Jillian and Jennifer demonstrate detailed knowledge of their predecessors' lives, but they also displayed behavioral patterns that suggested the presence of additional entities. During filmed interviews, the twins would suddenly stop speaking in their own voices and begin communicating in different accents, using vocabulary far beyond their years, addressing Dr. Stevenson by names he had never shared with the family. Most unnervingly, they began speaking brief phrases in languages they had never been exposed to: Latin, Gaelic, and what linguistic experts later identified as medieval English dialects. They're not just Joanna and Jacqueline, Stevenson wrote in his confidential notes. Something else has attached itself to their return, multiple somethings. The children are serving as vessels for entities that have been waiting in whatever realm exists between life and death, and their connection to this plane is growing stronger. The final warning came from the twins themselves. On Halloween night 1962, exactly 5 years after Florence's supernatural pregnancy had begun, both children woke screaming from identical nightmares. When their parents rushed to comfort them, the twins clutched each other with desperate fear. "The door is opening too wide," Jillian whispered. "Anthony can't hold it closed anymore. The old angry things are coming through, and they're hungry for warm bodies to wear." The climax arrived with the terrible inevitability of a nightmare reaching its conclusion. On May 5, 1963, exactly 6 years after the original accident, the Pollock twins announced they were going home to stay. Florence found them in the sealed bedroom that had belonged to their predecessors, though the door remained locked and the key hung untouched on her dresser. They sat among Joanna and Jacqueline's possessions as if they had always belonged there, their expressions bearing the weight of ancient knowledge. "We remember everything now," Jillian said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to echo from multiple throats. "But we're not the only ones who remember. The others are come to the spaces we opened, and they're angry about being dead for so long." The supernatural activity that had been building for years reached a crescendo that shook the very foundations of Hexham. Every mirror in town reflected images of children who weren't there. The cemetery gates opened on their own, and witnesses reported seeing small figures walking among the headstones, leading processions of shadowy adults toward the town center. Mrs. Day, the woman who had caused the original accident, had spent 6 years in a psychiatric facility. On this anniversary night, she was found dead in her locked room, her body unmarked but her face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Beside her bed, investigators discovered children's drawings that she could not have created. Crude crayon pictures depicting a car accident and 3 small figures rising from the wreckage with outstretched arms. As midnight approached, the twins began to change. Their faces took on the mature expressions of their former selves. Their voices deepened, and they spoke with the authority of children who had experienced death and return. But they were not alone in their transformed state. The temperature in the house plummeted, and John and Florence found themselves surrounded by the translucent figures of other children. Dozens of them, all bearing the marks of tragic deaths, all claiming kinship with Jillian and Jennifer. "We opened a way for them," Jennifer explained, her voice now clearly that of Jacqueline. "But we didn't know how many were waiting, how long they'd been trapped, how angry they were about being forgotten. The possession was not malicious, but desperate. These were not demons or evil spirits, but the souls of children who had died too young, too suddenly, too violently. They had found in the Pollock twins a pathway back to the warmth of living bodies, and they refused to return to the cold darkness of death." Dr. Stevenson's final report, sealed for decades, concluded, "The Pollock case represents not reincarnation in its traditional sense, but rather a phenomenon of soul displacement on a massive scale. The twins serve as conduits for multiple entities, creating a supernatural crisis that challenged the very boundaries between life and death. The twins disappeared that night. Their physical bodies found the next morning in the cemetery, lying peacefully atop the graves of Joanna and Jacqueline Pollock. They appeared to be sleeping, but no amount of medical intervention could wake them. Their consciousness had returned to wherever it had originated, taking with them the dozens of other child spirits who had used their living forms as vessels for one final taste of mortality. The case remains open, defying explanation, challenging science, and proving that sometimes love truly is stronger than death, even when that strength unleashes forces beyond human comprehension.